Welcome to Northeastern University's 5 Minute Primer series. This 5 Minute Primer will discuss secondary data and how you can use secondary data in research without participant consent. We'll start by looking at when secondary data is IRB regulated. Next, we'll look at when secondary data can be exempt from review using the exemption categories. And finally, we'll discuss what waivers exist for non exempt secondary data. First, secondary data means any data collected for any purpose other than your current study. Think organizational records, student homework, prior research data sets, etc. Before we get into the regulatory pathways, I want to highlight an important best practice that will help you think about secondary data and make this discussion make a little bit more sense. You should always be creating a separate copy of your data. You should not be analyzing data directly from the non research source you're pulling from. So, if, for example, you're pulling data from student records, you should be creating a separate spreadsheet containing the data that you need to analyze for research purposes and analyze only that spreadsheet. So, what makes secondary data use rise to the level of human subjects research that requires IRB review? It hinges on one question. Are you accessing identifiable private information about participants? If the data is publicly available, there's no need for IRB review because the data is publicly available and isn't private. Similarly, if the data you are accessing doesn't have any identifiers into it, you're accessing an entirely anonymized database. You're not conducting human subject research. But if the data contains identifiable private information, for example, names, email addresses, and can be linked back to individuals through a code or a key, then you are conducting human subject research and IRB review is required. There's an important carve out related to coded data. If the data is coded, and even if there's no identifiers in the data you receive, you must have a data use agreement in place, preventing the release of the key to Northeastern in order for the data to be considered non human subject research. Let's look at two common scenarios in social behavioral research. Scenario A, you have access to identifiers alone. For example, somebody provides you with a list of student emails, so you can send a recruitment email inviting them to participate in your survey. Since you have access to only identifiers and there's no data about the individuals, the IRB regulations regarding secondary data don't apply to the access of this because the activity doesn't involve any human subjects data. Scenario B, identifiers with data. Now imagine you have access to a data set with student names linked to course grades, and you want to use that to identify students below a 2.0 GPA to recruit only those students. Here you're accessing data about participants that contains identifiers. The activity is regulated, and we need to evaluate if consent is needed for the access of this data. Now, if you're accessing that identifiable private data, the first question is, does it fit under exempt category 4.2? This is the anonymized pathway. It allows you to access identifiable data, but requires that you record it in an anonymized manner. It's important to point out that you can't keep any kind of code that could relink the data. You also can't contact participants. So if you're accessing the data for recruitment or verifying eligibility, the study is not eligible for exempt review. Let's walk through a concrete example of how Exempt 4.2 works. Say you have access to student records which contain all kinds of information like names, IDs, GPAs, and majors. You want to study academic trajectories of students with a low GPA. Under Exempt 4.2, here's how it works. You can view the identifiable source data, that's fine. But what you record, your research data set, which should be a new separate data set, must strip out all identifiers. No names or student IDs or codes that can link back. You extract only the variables you need. This will be eligible for exemption because you're recording the data without identifiers, so you don't need any kind of consent pathway for this. What breaks this? If you plan to contact subjects based upon what you find of the data, if you need to link to data sets using names, it doesn't apply because now you're using those names. Um, if your study doesn't qualify for exempt 4.2, you're in the non exempt territory and you need a consent pathway. There are two main options for secondary data studies. Pathway A is a waiver for screening, recruiting, and determining eligibility. The IRB may approve accessing identifiable information solely for the purpose of reaching out to potential participants or verifying the eligibility. This means that you'll delete or won't retain the data after you contact the participants or have confirmed that they can take part in the study. The critical point is that no data from the source records may be retained for research purposes without additional consent. The next pathway is the waiver of informed consent. This is the pathway that you'd use if you want to analyze identifiable data for research purposes without consenting participants. There are 5 criteria that need to be met for a waiver of informed consent, but I want to highlight the hard criteria. It's the criteria that says the research could not be practically carried out without the waiver or alteration. We'll go into the next slide. Could not practically be carried out. This is the hard one. This is the hard criteria to meet. Here's a way to rephrase it. Why is it not possible to answer your research question if you had to obtain consent? Why can't you get consent? Here's an example of a strong justification. We are analyzing 10 years of student advising records. Consent cannot practically be obtained because many of the students have graduated and we anticipate that much of the contact information will be outdated. Requiring consent from only those who are still reachable would create bias in the data set. Identifiers are needed to link records across datasets and will be permanently removed once linking is complete. We see that this is a sound justification because it's impossible to recontact many of these students because we simply don't have contact information for them. Here are 2 examples that don't meet the threshold. The first example, we don't have the staff or time to consent participants. The regulatory bodies are explicit that cost, time, or administrative burden are not sufficient reasons to waive this criteria in of themselves. The second, we need the data of at least 30 participants. So if one person doesn't consent, our research won't be sufficiently powered. This is missing why the research can't increase the number of prospective participants that they consent to power the study adequately. So it doesn't meet the threshold. We've covered a lot of ground in this presentation, and I've tried to keep this as short and to the point as possible. I do want to highlight one closing point about permission. You must always ensure that you have permission and approvals to access and use the data you're accessing and using. We see a lot of researchers who have access to the data for non-research purposes and believes that this gives them permission to use the data for research purposes. This is not the case, and you need explicit approvals to use the data for this new purpose.